Good morning, everyone. This is Nathan Lindorf with The Rational Independent. Today, we return to the somewhat esoteric pages of the website Common Dreams. As you may or may not know, there was recently a little kerfuffle, a dust-up in the Tennessee House of Representatives. So, as we all know, there are state legislatures, and inside those state legislatures, there are elected representatives. They hold session, they pass legislation, they do everything that Congress does at a federal level, but at a state level. And because these state legislatures comprise a much smaller population, sometimes you get more quirky personalities, more interesting outcomes, and a little more movement. So as you may have heard, in the wake of last week's shooting in Nashville with the school shooting, there was a protest of some flavor, depending on how you describe it, in the Tennessee State House during a session of the House of Representatives. I believe it's in Nashville. There was a demonstration led, I believe, with megaphones personally by 3 Democratic House representatives. It got pretty rowdy. I mean, they definitely disrupted the order of the session. There was some shouting. Pretty sure there was some shoving. There was a refusal to vacate, a call for state troopers to come and clear the galleries. The protesters were kicked out, media was kicked out, and order was restored. As a result of that, it appears that the strongly Republican majority House has issued orders, resolutions for the expulsion of the 3 Democratic members, essentially saying that they acted in support of an insurrection, and according to their house's bylaws, that means that they are no longer fit to serve, and they are filing orders within the legislature to expel them. I'm not a parliamentarian. I don't know the ins and outs. I don't know if that's legit or if that's trumped up or what. I think it's worth exploring this a little bit in more detail, but first let's go through the article, see if we can draw out any juicy bits, see if I missed anything. The headline: Chants of fascists ring out as Tennessee GOP moves to expel Dems over gun control protest. "We will not be intimidated," wrote one of the Tennessee Democrats facing expulsion. "The people are demanding we act to stop kids from being murdered in school." Days after last week's shooting, thousands of demonstrators flooded the Tennessee state capitol to decry GOP lawmakers' inaction in the face of deadly gun violence. Inside the House chamber, 3 representatives took to the podium with a bullhorn and led demonstrators in chants supporting gun control legislation. All right, then the Republicans cast that as an insurrection, introduced 3 expulsion resolutions. Looks like they'll be voted on Thursday, so we'll see how that goes. So we've talked a little bit about the reporter tricks that you'll see if you're paying attention. Related to that, you'll also get particular language that joins the drumbeat of a particular narrative. For instance, gender-affirming care instead of the more medically accurate term genital mutilation, or equity instead of the more accurate term of communism, poverty, death, destruction, equality of outcome. Here's another one that's kind of interesting, another key that you can look for if you want to see bias in the articles that you are following. Look for particular statistics that serve a particular political narrative and often aren't sourced very well. Usually they are referred to or they're implied, but they'll never or rarely will they directly link to a source for a statistic, because usually the statistic is a little bit suspect. Here in this article for Common Dreams, this is not the first time I've seen this. You may have seen this particular statistic parroted by Jon Stewart on a recent interview with another state representative, I think of Oklahoma, that he was beating up on verbally for some reason, ratings or whatever, stating that gun violence is now the leading cause of death for children in the United States. Well, just for kicks and giggles, let's look at that. To their credit, they do include a link. Oh, good. It's the New York Times magazine and it's behind a paywall. Childhood's greatest danger, the data on kids and gun. I'm not going behind the paywall. Sorry, guys. But I can give you a quick summary of the statistic. First off, it's total bupkis. And here's why. As we've talked about before, the vast majority of gun deaths in America, probably 2/3 of people who die by gun violence in America, is suicide, which is a tragedy and it's a problem. But it's not at all comparable to the thing we fear, which is the specter of a mass shooting of innocents at a school. These are two separate things. They're both bad, but they're not the same thing. You can have cancer and heart disease, and they're both bad, but you can't treat them both the same way. Now, if you take the remaining 1/3 and you look at the cause of that violence, those gun deaths, those are gun homicides. The overwhelming majority of that remaining third, I want to say somewhere in the neighborhood of 80 to 90% of it, is directly related to crime, and particularly gang violence. And gangs exist because of the quote-unquote war on drugs. That's the primary reason for gangs' existence, is to push drugs that are illegal through normal channels. I'm not a libertarian in the sense that I don't think we fix everything by making heroin and fentanyl over-the-counter drugs, or whatever you want to call it. It's not as easy as that. If you have a society that's seeking to self-medicate, it's going to find ways to self-medicate, whether that's alcohol, whether that's junk food, whether that's heroin, or whatever. If you want to truly solve that problem, you need to dig into why we are seeking so desperately to self-medicate. That's a bigger topic for another day. What I'm trying to drive at in this particular conversation is that just because we have a lot of people die by gun violence, we need to, if we're going to come up with constructive solutions, we need to look and figure out why. So let's set aside for now gang violence, because we, I think, can all agree it is not the same thing as the, again, scary specter we've all come to fear of a mass shooting of innocents. Of those that remain, a handful do relate to mass shootings, and that's terrible. Mass shootings follow a particular pattern and should be analyzed and should be prepared against. If we want to keep our children safe, we should make changes that make our children safer. However, I can't trust an article that's supporting these protesters saying we need to act on gun violence, that then goes ahead and puts out a crummy statistic that has nothing to do with anything true or functionally productive in solving the problem that they're crying out about. And why do I say that? If you want to make the case that guns are the leading cause of death among children, you have to basically count as children, quote unquote, everyone up to 19 years old. And the vast majority of gun deaths among those older children are 15 to 19-year-old males, usually involved in street crime of some kind, usually gang affiliated. You can see why I made the gang connection earlier. Usually drug related, drug distribution related. You are making the case that this school shooting exemplifies an epidemic of gun violence among young people, that we need to protect the innocents, that it's such a crisis we have to invade the House of Representatives in the state where this most recent shooting happened. We need to disrupt the normal order of business in order to make a scene about how this has to be acted on now. And you're using as supporting evidence a statistic that has nothing to do with the school shooting you're crying out about. When I see such a poor set of reasoning, I have to ask, are you stupid? And I don't think they're stupid. I know the New York Times isn't stupid. Or are you disingenuous? Are you trying to push a political narrative for your own ends, separate and aside from what reality actually tells us? That's generally the side I come down on. I'm going to go ahead and give one of the reps that's facing expulsion the last word on this article. The quote, "The people are demanding we act to stop kids from being murdered in school," unquote. I'll give him the last word, but now it's time for my 2 cents. No one is on the other side of that position. It is incredibly disingenuous to believe or to present to the public that there are two factions on this issue. One faction says we need to stop the murder of children in our school, and the other faction says, I'm totally okay with the murder of children in our school. In fact, we should have more. That's not how this works. That's not truth. And if it's not true, then it's not going to help us move forward. Nobody wants more school shootings. Nobody wants more murdered kids. Nobody wants this to become worse. No one wants more violence. In our civil society who are discussing this issue, there is not a pro-kid murder side and an anti-kid murder side. This is a logical fallacy, commonly known as a straw man. It's much easier to win an argument if you pretend that your opponent's argument is terrible. So if you create this pretend argument for your opponent, where you present their argument as, they're saying that we should allow more children to be murdered. Well, that's an easy argument to win. Except that's not what they're saying. Big picture, we're seeing a breakdown in the legislative process. We're seeing, and it's not a perfect corollary, but there are some similarities. When you compare January 6th to something like this, protesters entering into a legislative body's area, preventing them from doing their business, delaying the business of the people, quote unquote, that the elected representatives are there to do. When you see that happen, regardless of which side of the aisle, that doesn't help anything. That is not helpful. It does not move the policy discussion forward. To briefly touch on January 6th, there was a huge number of people involved. It's a big old building, and not everybody did the same thing. And so to pretend and try and mash all those actions together, you are inevitably going to conflate and cause problems. For the record, for those who violently assaulted police officers, broke windows, damaged property, and entered without permission, all of you should go to prison. All of you should stand trial, rather, for things like assault, for things like trespass, for things like interfering with operation of the government, or I'm sure there's a fancy lawyer name for it. I'm totally okay with all of those trials proceeding. Give them a right to a speedy trial, give them a jury of their peers, give them adequate representation, have a trial, see if you can convict them. If you can, have them serve a commensurate sentence for what they did, and then move on with their lives. However, there are also other people who were in the Capitol building that day, who were let in, who were peaceful in their own actions, who basically treated it like an impromptu tour of the Capitol building. For those people, they did nothing wrong. If you were let into the building, if you were walked around the building by security, if at no point did anyone say leave, if, in fact, you had uniformed police officers, security forces saying, you may come in, you can't charge people like that with a crime. I don't want to go too far into that rabbit hole. Setting all that to the side now and looking at this situation in Tennessee. If you are a student who walked out of school to protest, more power to you. You'll get marked absent, but whatever. If you are a member of the state legislature who met up with those protesters and said, we support you, thank you for lending your voices to this important cause. Great. All of this is freedom of speech. All of this is fine. If you are a protester or a member of the legislature who disrupted the order of business, who trespassed when you were asked not to be there, who took over the podium with a megaphone, that's not acceptable. That's not normal order. Should not be allowed. We cannot turn our country into a country of the mob. We cannot allow the mob on the left or the right, on the Republican or the Democratic side, to say, if I just yell loud enough, I'll get my way. If we go that route as a society, we are doomed. I'm totally okay with the expulsion orders. I think that's reasonable. Tennessee can fight that out. That's their state legislature. Do what they like. I would really, really love it if we would stop holding political prisoners in Washington, D.C. People who did very little in the way of crime and yet are still in prison pre-trial without adequate access to medical care, without adequate access to legal counsel, without the availability of bail, that's still a thing. There are numerous people from January 6th who have not been tried yet, but have been in prison this whole time. That's not okay. That can't be okay. If that becomes okay, then we effectively have allowed political prisoners in the United States, kept by the government for their own political ends and subverting the criminal justice process. That could be a fatal failure of the Republic if it is allowed to stand. That's my 2 cents. Good luck out there.